千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together.
Everyone, we are once again together to explore the Tao Te Ching. Today, I am happy to say we will once again be connecting the Tao Te Ching with other great traditions to present an overall picture on the Tao and the intricate levels of its wisdom. Now, last time I mentioned that chapter 38 has special significance, and specifically I showed everyone this slide. I talked about how the Tao Te Ching itself is the combination of two parts, two books. The first book is Tao Jing, and that's chapter 31 to chapter 37. The second part is De Jing, 38 to 81. So this made 37 the last chapter of the first book, Tao Jing. And it makes 38 the first chapter of the second book, De Jing. And that's why we start out discussing the levels of De, which means virtue. So as you can see here, I also talked about how when Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching 2,500 years ago, roughly, he did not actually give it a name. He didn't point to it and say, well, I shall now call this Tao Te Ching. His intention at the time was just to create a summary of all the wisdom known to the Tao tradition at the time. And the Tao tradition had been going on before him for thousands of years, so he had plenty to summarize. Now, he was gifted with that ability to memorize, remember everything, and summarize everything. So when he was done, he thought of it as just, in his mind, he represented it as summary of all the Tao teachings. And he might have called it that, but he didn't give it a name. He just left it. So subsequent students of his writing called it the Tao Te Ching, and precisely because it's a combination of Tao Jing and De Jing. And Lao Tzu also did not call the first 37 chapters the Tao Jing, and he didn't call the second part of it De Jing. That's what people labeled it out of convenience, because the first part begins with a discussion on the Tao, the second part begins with a discussion on virtue. So that's why. And a note right below that, just so everyone knows, you're going to see all kinds of books out there discussing the Tao Te Ching, and many of them can be seen as, well, basically the author doesn't really know the original Chinese and therefore has to derive that work from other people. So De sometimes gets mistranslated for that reason. For our discussion, just keep in mind that it means virtue. Virtue is the single most accurate way to translate De. So the line right below at the very bottom of this slide, 上德不德，是以有德, that's what we talked about last time. We're going to revisit that briefly today. So here we are with chapter 38. I'm going to quickly go through slides that you have already seen. None of them will be built up with animation because you've already seen that. We're just going to review them in a quick recap. So initially, I showed this very dense, tiny text view of 38, and that's because I wanted to show the whole thing first. It's a long chapter, 29 lines, and it's possible to divide it into two parts. Just like the Tao Te Ching itself, in this particular case, this one chapter can logically break into two components. The higher one, the one above, as you can see, is talking about the different levels of attainment. So there's a whole bunch of highlighted characters that you see here, characters in red. These are the characters translated as high and low, respectively. And this is talking about the different levels of each concept. So right off the bat, at the beginning, you see that virtue can be discussed in terms of high virtue and low virtue. So that's actually important. We'll talk about that more. And then later on, it also gets into high benevolence, high righteousness, and high etiquette. And we should be able to cover that very completely today. Now, the second part at the bottom that you see there starts talking about what happens when you lose these different levels. And what happens is that you have to take the next step down. So with this, Lao Tzu is setting up a hierarchy. He's setting up actually value judgment on these different levels of attainment. So just from this, you can see right away that in an authentic tradition of the Tao, there is value judgment. So the authentic tradition is unlike New Age thought, as an example, where all things are seen as good, equal, perfect, each in their own way. In the Tao tradition, that is not so. There's better and worse. I'll talk about that more as we continue on. For now, though, I want to present the more comfortable view of the top half and the bottom half, separated and in a larger size text. Here's the top half, and we did quite a bit of work on this last time, analyzing the repeating characters, the different sections, as you can see. So we can group the first 4 lines together in a subsection of a major section. And as you can see, the first 4 lines is all about high virtue and low virtue. And the highlighted characters highlighted in red show the repeating patterns, highlighted with the yellow highlighter, also showing repeating patterns. I wanted to separate them to make sure that they don't get mixed up together, so this is not like a sea of red text. Then I also pointed out that we have a lot of repeating characters from line 6 all the way to line 13, as you can see. So what about the second subsection here? We talked about the first subsection being high virtue and low virtue. The second subsection, actually the same. It continues with that. So that is the reason why from line 1 to line 8, we regard that to be a section by itself, a section on high virtue and low virtue. It talks about them in different ways, and they're both important. So today, I want to bring you a way to gain insight into high virtue and low virtue from a Zen Buddhism perspective. So that's actually a lot of fun for me. Previously, we were able to connect the Tao with Confucian teachings as embodied in the work known as the Great Learning. So you saw the correspondence previously yourself between passages in the Tao Te Ching to lines from the Great Learning, 大学. This time, I'm happy to say, we'll do the same thing, connecting high virtue and low virtue to Zen. So there'll be more to say about that when we get closer to it. For now, though, sticking to this particular slide, what we also talked about previously, from line 9 to 15, it's a series of concepts. High benevolence in line 9, high righteousness, line 11, High etiquette, line 13. Well, what do those concepts mean? And how are they described by Lao Tzu in the original text? How are they different? What is the distinction? This particular section in the Tao Te Ching can be a little confusing because the distinctions are quite subtle. And knowing what those distinctions are, the great benefit is that it gives you insights into the way that the original Tao sages think. So again, we will get closer to that. We will come to it. For now, though, I want to point to the place where we ended last time. We were able to get to line 4. We were able to talk about them in detail, line by line. So what follows is simply going to be a recap of our discussion from before. Now, this is only line 1 to line 15, which is the first half of Tao Te Ching 38. What about the second half? Well, we went through that as well last time. Here's what our end result looked like. Previously, with our sectional analysis, it took longer because this is a longer chapter. So the correspondence that I pointed out before, number 1 was the repeating characters from 16 to 19. This part talks about what happens when you lose one level of attainment and you have to go to the next best one, the next level down, basically. Then below that, we have 3 lines to talk about a particular kind of person, those who have etiquette. Now, taken at face value, those who have etiquette may be seen as a positive thing, like, oh, that person is so polite, that person is so courteous. But I want to be clear that here, Lao Tzu is actually speaking of those people in a negative context, like people who are fake, people who are plastic, not genuine, not authentic. I'll have a lot more to say about that when we get to it. It's the same thing with the next 3 lines. Those with foreknowledge, well, I mean, that's a good thing, right? Well, Lao Tzu is going to explain why it's actually a negative thing. So the highlighted text with the yellow highlighter that you see here are the characters from 21 and 24 that correspond to the same characters in 27 and 28. The last part is where Lao Tzu is very explicit on why those with etiquette and those with foreknowledge are the shallow kind of person, and the Tao cultivator will be the person with substance, will be the person who has depth. So that's way in the back, way toward the end of 38. So I want to bring everybody back to the beginning, back to our previous discussion, and then continue from there. As you can see, there is a lot of material to cover. And one observation that I have seen just now is a very good one. Before we leave this particular slide, I want to point out those who have etiquette in modern times, we see that as well. We see that as hypocrisy. We also see it as being overly politically correct. When someone is attempting to gloss over the meaning of certain words by using a different term, right? And when you are being politically correct, you may be seen as having etiquette. And yet, it is not necessarily who you are. Indeed, the politically correct language may be a mask over how you really feel, or maybe a way to dress up reality. So either way, it prevents us from getting at the truth. So we do have modern equivalents to everything that Lao Tzu is talking about here. So now let's go back to the beginning of what we discussed. So previously, we went through the first 4 lines. As you can see, it's about 上德, high virtue, and 下德, low virtue. So we described the nature of high virtue. It is a natural thing. It comes from within, comes from the heart. It's completely authentic. It's sourced in the Tao. It's relaxed. It doesn't have to be forced by anything or anyone. It just flows naturally. 下德, the opposite, is what we will get to in the next slide. So in this slide, what we talked about was that when you have high virtue, you don't need to be constantly, consciously aware of being virtuous. You are simply virtuous without having to think about it. It's just who you are. So that's high virtue. So we also talked about low virtue. So high virtue, as you can see in this slide, without pretentious contrivance. It's the purest form of virtue. And I would also say high virtue is right next door to the realm of the Tao. In order to reach the Tao, you must go through the realm of high virtue. This state of being where virtue flows from you naturally, you don't have to think about it, it's who you are. And that's why those who have high virtue don't need to showcase their virtues. They don't need to bring attention to it. They don't need to draw people's attention. In fact, Tao cultivators are the kind of people who feel no need to draw extra attention to themselves. As we look around in the world, we see many people who have that need. Whether they dress themselves in an unconventional way or present themselves with an unconventional appearance or act up. Occasionally in a crowd, you will be able to spot a person like that. The person who is extra loud, laughing constantly, and it's not necessarily genuine. So low virtue can also be seen as the people who are constantly talking about virtues, and therefore, oftentimes they're just preaching to everybody around them. They can be very dogmatic, they can be very aggressive, demanding that you follow them, demanding that you live up to their standards. But in many cases, because they don't actually possess the virtue, they are not able to live up to those standards themselves. So we talked about that last time. Let's continue. Another slide to quickly recap is about how when you have to work that hard to be virtuous, well, it's a sure sign that you are lacking in virtues. Or when you are just talking about virtues to other people and not actually practicing virtues naturally, then you also possess low virtue. So what I want to do, this is what we got to last time. As you know, I like to illustrate these ancient lines with examples. And my examples sometimes come from modern times, sometimes come from ancient Chinese history. So I would like to take a moment to share a story with you to illustrate this concept of high virtue and low virtue. And this example, as I mentioned at the beginning of our meeting today, comes from Zen Buddhism. So let's talk about Zen Buddhism for just a moment. There are often questions being asked about the difference between Zen and Tao. Understanding of those two terms are usually vague, a little fuzzy. So I get asked those questions as well. And it doesn't help that those terms are not that well defined. Now, Zen Buddhism is, I'll just start by giving you one particular view of it, and then we will see more examples as we go. Zen Buddhism can be seen as the fusion of Buddhism and the Tao. Many concepts are similar, although they may go by different names. So originally, it was just Buddhism. And before that, when the original Buddha lived, an Indian prince who lived about 2,500 years ago, roughly around the same time that Lao Tzu lived, but in India, he was an Indian prince. He renounced his heritage. He decided to practice spirituality, and he taught spiritual truths about the Great Awakening and enlightenment to his followers. So that was the original Buddha, and that was from 2,500 years ago. At the time, there was no Buddhism because there was just the teaching of the Buddha. So now, of course, ever since the passing of the original Buddha 2,500 years ago, there's followers of his teachings that became Buddhism. So that ever since that time, it's been passed down from generation to generation. And this person that you see here to the right of the slide, that's Bodhidharma. He was the spiritual leader of Buddhism in India in his time. And he decided to travel to China to spread the teaching of Buddhism to China. So when he was there, he became the first great patriarch, the first teacher and spiritual leader of the Zen Buddhism tradition. So I want you to get the historical context that Buddhism came first. Then about 1,000 years after Buddhism had started in India, Bodhidharma visited China, and the fusion of his teachings and the Tao created Zen Buddhism. So the beginning of Zen Buddhism was roughly 1,500 years ago. Zen is actually a Japanese term. It's a term that we know well. We see it all the time, but it's actually Japanese and not Chinese. In Chinese, it is Chan. So Chan is Chinese for meditation or the meditative state. When it transmitted from ancient China to ancient Japan, that's when the term was translated from ancient Chinese to ancient Japanese. That's when it became Zen. And then from Japan, the concept of Zen spread to the rest of the world, including the West. And that is the reason why we know it as Zen Buddhism. So for Mandarin speakers, it's simply Tan Buddhism. Okay, so let's talk about the story here. Bodhidharma and the emperor. So this is obviously a significant point in history because we're talking about the beginning of Zen Buddhism here. And in Mandarin, we will call it Canzong, the Zen tradition. So Bodhidharma, this Indian monk who was the leader of Buddhism, is going to China to spread Buddhism. Now, in appearance, he is, as you see here, you can tell in this depiction in the slide that he looks quite different from the Asians, from the ancient Chinese who looked remarkably different. He was darker complected. He wore this full beard. Now his eyes were described as green in color. He was oftentimes, he had another name, the green-eyed barbarian. So he might have come from India, or and there's another scholarly investigation that say he might have also come from Persia or parts in between, at some point between India and Persia. Ancient Persia was known to the ancient Chinese as Po Si. So there's so the Bodhidharma is commonly recognized as being Indian, but there's a minority of scholars who thought he might be Persian. Either way, he's definitely not Chinese. He looked very different. He looked much more Caucasian than Asian. And he was greeted with a lot of reverence, a lot of respect, including the emperor of ancient China at the time, Liang Wudi. So let me take a moment to point to the characters below. You see a whole bunch of Chinese characters right below this. 达摩祖师与梁武帝. So the first four characters, 达摩, the first two characters, 达摩, that's Bodhidharma in Mandarin. 祖 means ancestor, 师 means teacher. Together, it's patriarch or spiritual leader, spiritual teacher. And he was the first leader of Zen Buddhism. Therefore, he is 祖师, 达摩祖师. And this character, the fifth character here, this character here in the middle is the character for and. And then Wu Di, that's Liang Wu Di, is the Wu emperor of the Liang dynasty. That's what that means. So when Bodhidharma reached China, most likely from India, it was news that the emperor received with a great deal of excitement and joy. Because you see, the emperor was a follower of Buddhism himself. So he lived roughly 1,500 years ago. So about 1,000 years after the time of Lao Tzu. Buddhism itself transmitted or spread from ancient India to ancient China several centuries after the time of Lao Tzu. So by the time of this particular emperor, it had taken roots in China for quite a few centuries. So this emperor was known as being very intelligent, and he studied the Buddhist sutras. He practiced the teachings of Buddhism. So he did many things that the Buddhist teachings advocated. He also advocated a vegetarian diet back in his days. He was very progressive. So he was a big fan of his spiritual leader. He regarded Bodhidharma as his personal spiritual leader. So he invited the Bodhidharma to visit the imperial palace right away. And once the Bodhidharma got there, the emperor could not wait to sit down with the Bodhidharma to discuss Buddhism. So the very first thing that the emperor said to Bodhidharma was the following. He said, "Ever since I ascended to the throne, I have built numerous temples and published countless sutras. So, Master, how much merit would you say I have accumulated?" Now, in asking this question, the emperor was fully expecting that Bodhidharma would be impressed. He was thinking to himself that in Bodhidharma's travel through China to reach the imperial palace, he had already seen the many temples. He had already seen for himself that Buddhism was spread far and wide in China. So Bodhidharma should be impressed. And therefore, he was expecting that Bodhidharma would praise him. He was used to being praised because of the huge amount of work that he had decreed should be done. And some even called him the Bodhisattva Emperor. And it was a label that he regarded with much pride. Because of this, because of the way he thought, where his head was at, he was absolutely shocked by the answer from the Bodhidharma. He asked the Bodhidharma, Master, how much merit would you say I have accumulated? And the Bodhidharma contemplated this question and responded, no merit at all. The emperor was like, what? Wait, hold on one sec. Something's wrong here. That can't be right. Because, well, the Bodhidharma did not even say something more moderate, like, well, you've done some good work, but it's not enough. You need to do more. Or you've accumulated some merit, but that's not a whole lot. You need to do more. Something like that. Something like that you would have expected. And he might say, well, Master, I simply need to work harder and spread the teaching even more. He was not expecting this complete negative answer. No merit at all, zero. So he asked, he's perplexed, and he asked, why? Why no merit at all? The Bodhidharma said, he explained, what you have created is in the material world. Therefore, it is positive karma in the material world. The temples, the sutras, these are things in the material world. The material world is ultimately elusive. So these works that you have done, ultimately elusive. It is like the shadow following you. You see the shadow and you point to it. You think that, yeah, there's something there, but it's the shadow. It's actually nothing. It is actually nothing of substance. So what you have done in the material world with the temples and the sutras, like a shadow. The shadow is the projection of an object blocking light. The material world is like a projection of the ultimate reality of the spiritual realm. There is actually nothing. Now, this is at a level above the emperor's understanding, although he was indeed a very intelligent man. So then, wanting to probe further, he asked, so, Master, what would be the real merit then? So Bodhidharma responded, he said, pure and clear wisdom that is wondrous, emptiness in the self. That is the true merit. It is not something to pursue in the material world. Now, let's also understand one thing. This ancient emperor, like most other emperors, was prideful, had an ego, which is why he loved the title of the Bodhisattva Emperor. So all of this, everything that Bodhidharma had talked about rubbed him the wrong way, as you can imagine. So he's thinking, well, wait a minute, I know something about this Buddhism stuff that you're talking about. Okay, well, I'm pretty accomplished. I've learned a few things as well. I'm gonna put you to the test, Master. I'm gonna turn the table around on you. So the emperor asked, sort of like a quiz, what is the foremost meaning of the divine truth? What is the highest teaching of the divine? What is it? Again, the Bodhidharma surprised him. He said, in the vastness of existence, there is no divinity. What did he mean by that? Well, the Bodhidharma truly understood the Zen and the Tao and the spiritual truths. He knew that in the unifying, underlying Tao of existence, there are no distinctions like the divine and the not so divine. the royalty, the nobility, the commoners, all of those distinctions fade into the oneness of the great unity. He knew this and he spoke the truth to the emperor. But then when he said there's no divinity, the emperor thought, whoa, wait a minute. Aren't you the most divine spiritual leader of Buddhists everywhere, including myself? So why would you even deny the divine nature that we all respect and revere within you? That doesn't make any sense. So the emperor said, he was so perplexed, he said, no divinity? Well then, who is the person sitting in front of me? The Bodhidharma said, I do not know. Again, demonstrating that he was at a level far beyond the learning of the emperor. So by this time, the emperor knew that he was shown the wisdom, and yet he was completely unable to digest at the moment. He was not a happy camper at that time. The two of them parted company in a way that was neutral at best, that was rather cold. And the story of the Bodhidharma actually continues beyond this point. You see, Bodhidharma, after leaving the imperial palace, went into China and eventually ended up in this forest, Shaolin. There's a temple there where he saw that the monks were rather weak, so he taught them exercise. And that, combined with China's previous martial arts tradition, gave us the Shaolin Temple and the Shaolin martial arts. But that's another story for another day. For now, we have to focus on this. We have to focus on why the Bodhidharma talked about the lack of merits. You can tell because he was the founder of Zen Buddhism, and he was also the founder of Shaolin Kung Fu, that this was an extraordinary individual. This was an incredible person, amazing person. So while he taught everyone the Dharma, what in Mandarin we will call 佛法, he understood the underlying spiritual teachings, which was actually connected to the Tao. So now I want to draw those connections for you. I want to make it more explicit. I want to bring together Zen Buddhism and the Tao in the way that he understood it, using the story as a launching point. So in the story, the emperor supported Buddhism with the intent to accumulate merits. Therefore, he had no merits at all. This is all the more true because the emperor didn't have to do anything to construct the temples or to print or copy the sutras. He only needed to say, let it be done, do it. He only needed to issue a command, which is easy for him to do. So, no merits at all. The Bodhidharma was so right. So in the Tao passage that we're studying, what does that correspond to? This is a demonstration of low virtue. 下德不失德, 是以无德. It means that low virtue never loses virtue, meaning never losing sight of virtue. You always want something in practicing virtue when you are at the low virtue level. And that is why it has no virtue. Or in the words of Bodhidharma, that is why it has no merit. So there's a total connection between the two, a straight line between the two. if you do good deeds with the purpose of accumulating virtues, you will end up with no virtues at all. Okay, so that's low virtue. What about maybe high virtue? True merit. This is the wording of the Bodhidharma. True virtue or true merit can only be attained with the emptiness of the self and letting go of attachments in the material world. How does Lao Tzu say the same thing? 上德不德，是以有德. High virtue is not virtuous, therefore it has virtue. So with the emptiness of the self, there is no specific particular awareness of doing something virtuous because it is just natural. Letting go of attachments in the material world so that you can practice and focus on the spiritual side of things. In other words, if you do good deeds because they flow naturally from you and not because you want to score some kind of points, then you will accumulate real virtue. That is the conclusion. That is the meaning behind the story that I call Bodhidharma and the Emperor. Okay, so past the story of Bodhidharma and the Emperor, we should now be continuing on with the next important point of this particular chapter. So let's forge ahead. Let's get into line 5. Line 5 says, high virtue takes no contrived action, 上德无为. So this is the parts that connects high virtue with 无为. And this is a connection that many of you have already noted. And let's go ahead and analyze line by line as we normally do. So first of all, 上德无为, it means at the highest level of virtue, you let virtuous actions flow naturally. Doing good is its own reason. Praise and rewards are not necessary. So I think everybody has that idea now. And indeed, if you think about it, this is really the diametrically opposite mindsets to what the emperor had when he met the Bodhidharma. So when you are at this level, you feel no need to draw attention or hide. If people notice your actions, it doesn't change anything. If they don't, it doesn't matter because you weren't looking for that in the first place. So let me be clear. When we talk about how Tao cultivators feel no need to draw attention, sometimes that gets twisted into, you gotta do everything anonymously, you avoid drawing attention to yourself, you take measures to evade notice. No, actually, that's not quite the Tao either. What happens is that the Tao cultivator simply takes action without doing anything to draw attention, but also without doing anything to hide your tracks, to specifically become anonymous. All of those become the opposite of Wu Wei. All of those become attachments. To draw attention, you're attached to getting attention. To hide, well, you're attached to being anonymous. No attachments means you just do it. Whatever happens, happens. If people notice, that's great. If they don't, that's also great. Doesn't matter either way. That's the mindset of the Tao cultivator. So I want to make sure everyone gets that impression. Now, this is a powerful and independent state because the one who acts from it does not need anything from anyone. Let me put some sort of emphasis here because what I want to say is that if you need to draw attention, you become a slave of attention. And the need for attention becomes a bottomless pit. It's never filled up You always need more. So to not need it makes you more powerful, makes you more independent. I hope that makes sense. Let's continue on. Lines 6 and 7. Let's tackle these. Line 6 says, and acts without agenda. Okay, let's talk about what that means. So the position that Lao Tzu has expressed with this entire chapter is that virtuous actions should be done without attachments. And that's Wu Wei. These are the characters for Wu Wei. Therefore, highly virtuous cultivators do good things because that's who they are. They're virtuous people, not for any particular reason. And that's Wu Yi Wei. And that's this part, the last 3 characters of line 6 is specifically about how you do good things because they're good. You do good things because you're a good person, not because you're trying to score points. Next, let's talk about line 7. 下德. Now, we're talking about low virtue now. So this is no longer in the realm of being without attachments and contrivance. This is the opposite. This is low virtue is very much attached and very much contrived. And that's why low virtue is never completely genuine. You're always doing things for certain reasons. It's not being altruistic. It's to serve your agenda. So acting with attachments is equivalent to serving some kind of hidden agenda. Okay, let's go to the next line, line 8. This is where we talk about the agenda. So my suggestion to really understand what Lao Tzu is talking about here, my recommendation is that you put this into your daily life by observing what people do. So mentally take a step back when you find yourself in a situation, observe people and ask, are they doing a particular thing for specific reasons or some sort of hidden agenda? That will be有以为. That is the characters in line 8. So here are some examples to help jog your reasoning as you your observation as you watch what people do. Question: are they doing that thing because they think it will make them look good? And it's also a good idea to reverse these on yourself. Am I doing this thing because I think it will make me look good? Now, it's okay if you find that your answer is yes, I'm doing this because I think it'll make me look good. But the important thing here is that I want you to be completely honest and transparent, especially with yourself. Am I doing something because it's going to make me look good? Be honest with yourself. That's the starting point to getting virtues to be natural. That self-honesty is so important in Tao cultivation. So let's take a look at another one. When you watch people doing a particular thing, ask, are they self-dealing? Meaning, are they trying to benefit themselves financially while pretending otherwise? Or benefit themselves in other ways? So, and one more. Are they trying to score points for their side as part of a prevalent us versus them tribal mentality? So it's not necessarily a financial benefit, but are they trying to score some points for their team to be a good team player, to be seen as a good team player, as a valuable player, etc. So all of these can be hidden agenda. All of these can be selfish reasons. But in the Tao, you must always take the yin with the yang and the yang with the yin. So as you observe, you don't want to be focusing on just the negative aspects of life. You also want to pay attention to the positive aspects. So yeah, it's possible that they're only doing it to look good. They're only doing it to benefit themselves financially. They're only doing it to win for their side. Those are all possibilities. But it's also possible that a particular person is doing a particular thing purely out of compassion, purely out of a kind heart. That's possible too. But do not discount the possibility of that. And do not discount the possibility that people are using contrived actions as a discipline, as a practice, so they can get to high virtue. As I mentioned before, the road to the Tao leads through high virtue. You must pass through high virtue to get to the Tao. The naturalness of high virtue is the closest thing to the naturalness of the Tao. Now, it's just like that with low virtue. To get to high virtue, you start with low virtue. You start with having to constantly remind yourself to be virtuous until it becomes second nature. Then when it's natural, you are at the high virtue level. Makes sense, right? So low virtue is not something to scoff at. It may be a necessary part of a journey. Keep that in mind. It may be discipline. And your agenda, when you're in the low virtue level, your contrived action is to propel yourself to reach a higher level of virtue. That's the bottom line. So now, what I want to do is to bring you another story from the Zen Buddhism tradition. So let me show you what the slide looks like. Okay, so in this depiction, we see two people, and at the top of the slide, you get their names, Huinan and Shen Xiu. And I realize that this Ching Xiu is probably hard to pronounce, but actually it's easy to pronounce in Mandarin. Shen Xiu. It's just that it's not phonetically depicted in a way that's easy for a native English speaker. So with these two, who are they? Now, you can see that there's writing on the wall there. Huinan has what looks like the poem, and Shen Xiu does as well. Huinan to the left, Shen Xiu to the right. So Huinan looks like he's wearing this normal, everyday clothing for ancient China, while Shen Xiu is in the Buddhist robes. So I should tell you about these two before we get into the poetry between the two of them. So Shen Xiu is a monk, as you see here, and Huinan, as the story begins, was a commoner. So he's a young man, as depicted here, and he was always a very intuitive thinker. He knew nothing initially about Zen Buddhism, but then one day, while running errands, he heard the Diamond Sutra being recited, and it connected with him. It had a powerful effect on him. He right away, in that moment, knew that he wanted to study Zen Buddhism, that he needed to do everything he could to learn Zen Buddhism. So he decided to travel to seek out the leader of Zen Buddhism at the time. Now, this story occurs more than a century after the time of Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma became the first patriarch of the Zen Buddhism tradition. He passed it down to the second patriarch, and then the third, and the fourth, the fifth. So by the time that Huineng, the young man, traveled in search of Zen Buddhism, he was seeking the fifth patriarch. So in other words, by his time, Zen Buddhism had already been in China for 5 successive generations of spiritual leaders. So when he got to there, it's a monastery, it's a Zen Buddhism temple with many students, many disciples learning from the fifth patriarch. The leader of all the disciples was Sen Xiu. So that is why he's in Buddhist robes. Huineng was just a commoner. He was just a lay person seeking wisdom and knowledge and teaching from the fifth patriarch. So he was accepted by the fifth patriarch as part of the disciples, and he was given menial tasks to perform at the temple. At the temple, everyone was expected to work. They work and they study, and that's how life went on in that remote monastery for Zen Buddhism. So then one day, the fifth patriarch contemplated the next generation. He knew that he was getting old. He should be retiring soon. He should be passing on the mantle to the next patriarch, who will be the sixth. Now, who should it be? Well, the logical choice seems to be this person on the right, Sen Xiu. Sen Xiu was excellent in every way. He studied diligently. He was a great leader to all the disciples. Everyone liked him and respected him. Everyone thought that for sure Sen Xiu would become the sixth patriarch. But the fifth patriarch knew that the key for him to pass on Zen Buddhism was not to the popular choice necessarily. Sometimes it may be to the popular choice, but the passing down, the passing on of the torch for Zen Buddhism was not a popularity contest. He needed to pass it on to someone who really got it, who really understood Zen Buddhism. Well, how do you tell that? You can't read someone's mind. You can't even ask them like multiple choice questions and say which one is the correct answer. So what the way that he chose to figure out who had the understanding was that he thought about this, and then he made this announcement. He said to all the disciples, it's time for me to pass on the duties of the patriarch to the sixth, and I need to select from someone who really understands our tradition, our teachings, and the great truths of Zen Buddhism. So I want everyone, he addressed all the disciples, I want everyone to write a poem to describe, to express your understanding. And if I see someone who really gets it, I will pass down the robes of the Bodhidharma and the begging bowl of the Bodhidharma to that person. The Buddhist robes and the begging bowl of the Bodhidharma passed down, for by that time more than a century, is the symbol of power in Zen Buddhism. It's only the patriarch who is qualified to take them as part of his position. So this was an interesting challenge, and this is in modern times this would boggle the mind, because it is like you have this religious tradition and you're trying to find the next leader for that, and the way that you find it is to get everyone to write poetry, right? It boggles the mind. But this is the way that he chose. Most of the disciples, they automatically forfeited. They automatically decided to give up. They all said, well, I mean, of course it's going to go to Sen Xiu. Why should we even bother? So they didn't come up with their own poetry at all. They were all looking to Sen Xiu. Now, Senshou was truly excellent as a Zen monk, and he was also very humble. So he thought, well, okay, well, everybody's expecting me to do something. Should I do something? Well, but if I write something, that means that I'm trying to go after this position. That's really ill-befitting the teachings that I've been studying. I shouldn't do that. But then on the other hand, I have this command from my master to do it. So I really have to. And plus, this will be a way for me to learn from my master, the fifth patriarch, how much I really know. He can tell by reading my poetry where I'm at. He can provide me with feedback that will, allow me to grow further. So, okay, I should do it. So he wrote this poem, and the poem that he wrote is, as you see on the right-hand side of the wall there. And when the other disciples saw this, they all said, wow, what a great poem. They all decided to commit it to memory. So every day, as they went about their tasks, they were all reciting this, making it like a chant. So Huineng heard this as well. Now remember, Huineng is a powerful, intuitive thinker with a direct understanding of the Zen teachings. When he heard it, he immediately understood where Senshou was at. And he immediately figured out that there was a level above what Senshou understood. That Senshou at that level was not yet ready to touch. So he decided in the middle of the night to express his understanding in his own poem, which you now see on the left side of the slide. Now, of course, I realize that as you're looking at this, these poems mean nothing. So I want to translate that for you. And I want to show that to you in the next slide. Dueling poems, Senshou and Huineng. So here's what Senshou wrote. This is the same thing that you saw in the previous slide. I am writing it out left to right, up to down, instead of it's all the same characters, but just wrote out differently in a different sequence. So what does it say? What does it mean? Here's the translation. This is, by the way, this is my own translation because the translations used by scholars and academics I find to be not very satisfactory, so I had to come up with my own. This, I can guarantee, is the absolute closest that one can come to in the English language. Body is the Bodhi tree. Mind is like clear mirror stand. Strive to clean it constantly. Do not let the dust motes land. What does it mean? The Bodhi tree, also known as the tree of wisdom, that is the tree that the original Buddha sat under in meditation when he attained enlightenment. So here, Senshou is comparing the human body, the physical body, to the Bodhi tree. And therefore, he's also, by extension, comparing the Buddha nature that everyone has to the Buddha that is sitting next to the Bodhi tree in meditative pose. So that right away, that line establishes that Senshou had a great understanding of Buddhism. Mind is like clear mirror stand. So he's comparing the human mind and also heart to the stand upon which a clear mirror is installed. So This is often mistranslated as the mind is like clear mirror or bright mirror. These are all poor quality translations. Let me explain. If you say that the mind is clear mirror stand, then the mirror itself would be the soul, a distinction between the spirit and the thinking process. So once again, the original depicts Shen Shou as a monk at a very high level of understanding and able to express that in just a few characters. Then he says, strive to clean it constantly. Clean the mirror. Do not let the dust motes land, because everyone knows if you have this mirror that you have sitting around, if you don't do anything to it, it's going to gather more and more dust. It's going to get dusty. You have to wipe it clean, and you have to do this all the time. There's always dust coming to land on the mirror. So this is a metaphor. It's a rallying cry to the disciples of the fifth patriarch that everyone should be practicing Buddhism, the Buddhist teachings, constantly. That's what he means by cleaning it constantly, is to clean the soul, so to speak. Do not let the dust motes gather and obscure the brightness, the clarity of the soul. So that's his level. That's his understanding. Now, before we go further, I want to point out to everyone that the translation has the word strive in it. So if you recall from my previous talks, in the Tao, there is no strife. So the moment you say strive to clean it constantly, the moment you realize that this is actually not exactly at the level of the Tao. So that is the same realization from Huineng when he heard this, when he heard the other disciples reciting it. He asked to be led to where the poem was written on the wall. So when he saw that, he asked for help to write his own poem. So here's what he wrote. These two poems have been set to music. They are one of the most well-known poetry in Chinese culture. So what was the response from Huineng? Here's the absolutely most accurate translation possible. I'm very comfortable in claiming this because I've spent literally years to polish this up. Huineng wrote, Bodhi really has no tree, nor is clear mirror the stand. Nothing's there initially. So where can the dust motes land? That was the response. So let me break it down for you. What Huineng is saying is that all of these things that we're so concerned about, these are manifestations of the physical world, the material world. If we can see through the illusory manifestations, we would realize the true reality, the reality of the intangible, of the Tao, of the spirit, of the soul. It's emptiness. So it's empty, and intentions are part of that emptiness. The soul, the spirit are all part of it. Those are the real things. Material objects, not so much. Therefore, clear mirror is not the stand. The soul and this physical stand are actually quite different. There's actually nothing. So where can the dust motes land? If you are, so in other words, if you are attached, if you are very set in thinking that there's something rather than emptiness. So for instance, if you think of your own reputation, your own ego, your self-respect as things that can be wounded when someone insults you, boy, it's time for war. You wage all-out war to avenge yourself when someone says something that you take as an offense. But if you recognize that there's actually nothing, it's actually all just material world squabbling, illusory manifestations, then you can be free of the ego and the dust motes have nowhere to land. That is the realm of Wu Wei, the realm of detachment, and the realm of the Tao. So now let's draw a connection. Let's make the correspondence. Let's showcase the correspondence between Zen Buddhism and the Tao. In Zen Buddhism, at the level where Senshou is at, strive to clean and constantly describes the discipline. It's the discipline that can eventually lead you to the ultimate attainment. Ultimate attainment meaning the great awakening, the enlightenment. But the discipline is not the attainment. The vessel that takes you to the distant shore, the opposite shore, that vessel is not the destination. It's the means of getting there. I think everyone follows that, right? Now, the Tao says low virtue takes contrived action and acts with agenda. So remember, low virtue can be fake, but it can also be discipline. It can also be something that you do in order to rise to the level of high virtue. So either way, it's contrived action and acts with agenda. Agenda by itself can be a positive or negative thing. You may have a hidden selfish agenda. That could be negative. Or your agenda could be to better yourself. That could be positive. All right, so that's one aspect of it. What Senshou was describing maps directly to the state of low virtue, but in a positive way, in the disciplined way. What about high virtue? Nothing's there initially. Is the realization, a spiritual awakening that the world is illusory and the emptiness of the Tao is the true reality. Wow. Lao Tzu says it this way. High virtue takes no contrived action and acts without agenda. And that is because high virtue is a state where you have realized that there's no need to battle one another in the material world. There's no need to try to showcase yourself as the best of the best. You no longer have the agenda to do that. All of those are part of the squabbling that we do in the material world. You free yourself from it, and that allows you to practice high virtue. So there's plenty more. There's a lot more details in the story about Huineng. And I want to make a reference here that if you are interested in the full story, you can easily find it at www.taoism.net. In your browser, you can simply type taoism.net and it will take you there. Once you are there, you'll see right in the middle of the menu, Platform Sutra. Clicking on that takes you to 10 chapters in the Platform Sutra. There's actually a lot more of the Platform Sutra. I'm gonna have to work on the rest, but from 1 to 10 actually completes the origin story of Huineng, how he heard about Zen Buddhism, how he went to the fifth patriarch to study, how he encountered this test from the master, the fifth patriarch, and how he prevailed by demonstrating a higher level of wisdom, and then received the begging bowl and the robe, which, by the way, no longer exist. That is because part of the story in this Zen Buddhism tradition is that there was such squabbling and contention over the begging bowl and the robe, the robes of the Bodhidharma, that the sixth patriarch Huineng came to the realization that these symbols of authority have become the bone of contention to fight after. Therefore, from that point on, from the time of sixth patriarch onward, no longer the passing down of the bowl and the robes. Those are, after all, the manifestations of the material world. So it would be fun and interesting if the begging bowl and the robes are still on display in at a museum someplace as a historical relic, or maybe as holy items in the current practice, in today's practice of Zen Buddhism. But no, that is not the case. Everybody who learns from Zen Buddhism should understand that this is something to free yourself from, to detach from. Excellent. So we have now covered the two stories that I most wanted to do to illustrate the principle behind those first lines of chapter 38. Now, there's a lot more to talk about, obviously, and I hope you enjoyed this linkage between the Tao and Zen Buddhism. A lot more stories to tell, a lot more concepts to cover. For now, though, I'm looking at the clock and I see that we have to get to our summary. We have to talk about the summary and then bring the meeting to an end. So, but I'm glad we got to the second story, because that brings everything to a nice logical end. I also want to mention to everyone that I talked about how chapters 1 to 10 that you see at Taoism.net, that's just the beginning parts of the Platform Sutra that tells the origin story of how Huineng came to be the sixth patriarch. Well, there's way more after that. That whole thing from 1 to 10 is considered to be one part, part 1, and then part 2, part 3 goes on much further in part 3, which sometimes is just called chapter 3, because 1 to 10 is seen as chapter 1. In chapter 3 or part 3, Huineng is asked the question from those who are learning from him that, hey, master, could you explain the story of the Bodhidharma and the emperor? What happened when Bodhidharma said that the emperor had no merits? Could you explain that? That's actually part of the Platform Sutra as well. So there's connection beginning to end and everything coming full circle. I've not had the time, I've not had the chance to translate that part of the Platform Sutra. It's a huge amount of work. So I have to tackle it one step at a time. But one day we will have the complete Platform Sutra up on Taoism.net. For now, I want to bring you another key concept from Dao De Jing 38. This slide is going to look similar to the slide from last time, but the slide from last time, the summary from last time, it was keyed to the first story, the Bodhidharma and the emperor. This particular summary slide is connected to the second story, which is the story of Huineng and Shen Xiu. So the signature line to represent that is 上德无为而无以为, So the pinyin down here, 上德无为而无以为. I hope that's helpful. This can be a chant that you incorporate into your meditative practice, but let me explain what that means and how we can apply it to life. Similar to last time, but at a slightly different perspective, different angle, the highest form of virtue is never contrived. With it, you always act without personal, selfish, hidden agenda. Now, here's how we can cultivate high virtue. So last time, we had the exact same heading in the previous summary. And this time, we have the same setting as well, but from a different angle, from the angle of Zen Buddhism. And then the last, so it's also in 3 parts, and the last one is the same as the previous summary, because we want to tie everything together, have everything come full circle. So how to cultivate 上德, high virtue. Number 1, learn from Huinen's poem and realize that the petty conflicts in our lives are ultimately illusory. And let me say this. If we don't see that now, if someone doesn't see this truth now, that petty conflicts in our lives are ultimately illusory, I can guarantee you that on this person's deathbed, this truth will be pretty self-evident. So apply that to yourself. If you think about, look at, contemplate the petty conflicts in your lives, you don't see them as ultimately illusory, well, you will see them as ultimately illusory when the time comes for you or me on the deathbed. It's the ultimate truth. Number 2, because those conflicts are ultimately illusory, we must stick to what is real. The real, in this case, is defined as the flow of natural virtues and compassion from the heart. Act from the heart naturally. Cultivate, encourage the best from yourself to others. That's how we can get closer and closer together to the realm of high virtue, and then from there, take one step into the realm of the Tao. Lastly, same as before, keep in mind that 上德 is the direct path leading to the Tao.
Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.